I never thought my peaceful lakeside retirement would turn into a legal war, but that's exactly what happened when Brenda Carmichael moved into the Whispering Pines community and decided my dock was ruining her life. My name is Aaron O'Brien, and I had spent 30 years working as a construction foreman in Minneapolis before finally saving enough to buy my dream property on Lake Minnetonka, Minnesota. The house was nothing fancy, just a modest two-bedroom cabin built in the 1970s, but it came with something extraordinary. I owned the actual lake bed extending 200 feet from my shoreline. The previous owner, an eccentric old millionaire named Walter Gunderson, had purchased the submerged land rights back in 1982 when the state was selling them off. When I bought the property in 2019, those rights transferred to me. I had the deed, the surveys, and all the legal documentation proving that particular stretch of lake bottom belonged to me as surely as the ground my house sat on. I built my dock in the summer of 2020, right after the world went crazy with the pandemic. It was a therapeutic project, something to keep my hands busy while everything else felt uncertain. The dock stretched out about 60 feet from shore, with a covered section at the end where I could sit and fish even when it rained. I added solar lights along the sides and a small bench at the terminus. It became my favorite place on earth. Every morning, I would walk down with my coffee and watch the sun rise over the water, and every evening I would return with a beer to watch it set. The Whispering Pines HOA existed when I moved in, but it was remarkably hands-off. The community consisted of about 40 homes scattered around the northwestern shore of the lake, and the HOA basically handled road maintenance and snow plowing. They met once a quarter, approved a budget, and left everyone alone. The annual dues were $300, which seemed reasonable for what we got. The president was a retired dentist named Frank, who had held the position for 15 years simply because nobody else wanted to deal with the paperwork. Everything changed in April 2024 when Brenda Carmichael bought the house 3 lots down from mine. She paid cash, some kind of divorce settlement according to the neighborhood gossip. The house she bought was set back from the water about 100 yards, up on a slight hill. From her back deck, you could see the lake if you stood at the railing and looked past the trees and the 2 houses between us. It was not what anyone would call a prime view, but she had known that when she bought the place. I first met Brenda about a week after she moved in. I was heading down to my dock around 7 in the morning when I heard someone calling out. I turned to see a woman in her early 50s marching across my lawn. She had that particular haircut, the short bob that somehow signaled trouble, and she wore expensive athletic wear that had probably never seen actual exercise. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp enough to scatter the birds. "Are you the owner here?" "That's right," I said, setting down my coffee mug on the porch railing. "Aaron O'Brien, you must be the new neighbor." "Brenda Carmichael," she said, not offering her hand. "I need to talk to you about that dock." I glanced down at the water where my dock sat peacefully in the morning light. "What about it? It's blocking my view of the lake," she said, as if this were self-evident. "I was hoping we could work something out. Maybe you could move it to the side, or at least remove that covered section at the end." I stared at her for a moment, trying to process the audacity. "Madam, you're 3 houses down and set back from the water. I don't see how my dock affects your view in any way." Her face tightened. "From my deck, when I look at the lake, that structure is directly in my sight line. It's an eyesore, and frankly, I don't think it's even legal." Most communities have regulations about dock sizes. "The HOA has no restrictions on docks," I said calmly. "I checked before I built it, and even if they did, I own the lake bed. It's private property." She laughed, a brittle sound. Nobody owns the lake bed, that's public water. Actually, I do, I said. I have the deed and the surveys. Walter Gunderson bought the submerged land rights decades ago and they transferred to me with the house. We'll see about that, Brenda said, turning on her heel. I'm calling an emergency HOA meeting. This is unacceptable. She stormed off before I could respond. I watched her go, feeling the first stirrings of unease. I had dealt with difficult people in my construction career, but something about Brenda's entitled anger suggested this was not going to blow over quietly. The emergency meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at the community center, a small building near the entrance to Whispering Pines. I showed up with my deed, my surveys, and my original building permits. About 20 homeowners attended, which was twice the usual turnout. Brenda had clearly been working the phones. Frank opened the meeting with his usual low-key demeanor. Okay, folks, Brenda has requested we discuss dock regulations. Brenda, you have the floor. Brenda stood up, holding a stack of printed photos. She began passing them around. As you can see from these pictures, Aaron O'Brien's dock is a massive structure that dominates the shoreline and blocks sight lines for multiple properties. I've spoken with several neighbors who share my concerns but were afraid to speak up. I looked at the photos. She had clearly used a telephoto lens to make my dock look larger and closer to her property than it actually was. The angles were deliberately misleading. That dock was built without any community input, Brenda continued. It violates the aesthetic standards we've all agreed to maintain. I'm proposing we implement immediate regulations limiting dock size to 30 feet in length with no covered structures. Hold on, I said, standing up. First of all, that dock was built 4 years ago with all proper permits from the county. Second, the HOA has never had dock regulations, and you cannot retroactively enforce rules that did not exist when the structure was built. Third, and most importantly, I own the lake bed where my dock is located. It's private property. Brenda's face flushed. That's ridiculous. You cannot own the bottom of a lake. Actually, I can and I do. I pulled out the deed and passed it to Frank. This clearly shows the submerged land rights. Walter Gunderson purchased them from the state in 1982. It's all legal and recorded. Frank examined the document, his eyebrows rising. Well, I'll be damned. I never knew this existed. It doesn't matter, Brenda snapped. The HOA has the authority to regulate what can be seen from community properties. Your dock is a visual blight. A few people murmured in agreement, but most looked uncomfortable. My neighbor to the south, a kind woman named Margaret, spoke up. I can see Aaron's dock from my place, and I've never thought it was a problem. It's actually quite nice looking. You're right next to him, Brenda shot back. Your property value isn't affected. Those of us who bought here for the lake views are being cheated. You're 3 lots away and 100 yards back from the water, I said, trying to keep my voice level. You can barely see the lake, let alone my dock. I can see it perfectly well, and it ruins the whole vista, Brenda said. I'm calling for a vote. All in favor of implementing the new dock regulations. Wait, Frank said, holding up his hand. We cannot just vote on this tonight. We need to review our bylaws, consult with our attorney, and give proper notice. This requires an amendment to our CC and Articles, which means we need a 2/3 majority and a 30-day comment period. Brenda looked furious, but she sat down. Fine, let's do it properly, but I expect this to be on next month's agenda. The meeting dissolved into smaller conversations. Several people came up to me afterward, apologizing for the drama. She's been going door to door all week, Margaret told me quietly, showing those misleading photos and claiming your dock is destroying everyone's property values. Some people are buying it. Over the next month, Brenda escalated her campaign. She hired a lawyer, some slick guy from Minneapolis who sent me a certified letter claiming my dock constituted a private nuisance and demanding I remove it within 30 days. I took the letter to my own attorney, a straightforward woman named Patricia Holmes who specialized in property law. Patricia read the letter and shook her head. "This is nonsense. You own the lake bed, you have all the proper permits, and your dock meets every legal requirement. The HOA cannot force you to remove it, especially not retroactively." "What should I do?" I asked. "Let me respond," she said. "I'll explain the legal realities. If they want to push this, they'll lose badly." Patricia sent a detailed response outlining my property rights and the legal precedents supporting my position. Brenda's lawyer fired back with a longer letter full of threats and dubious legal theories. The correspondence continued, each exchange more hostile than the last. The formal HOA meeting in June was packed. Brenda had organized a full campaign, with signs and flyers distributed throughout the community. "Preserve our views," they proclaimed, with more of those deceptive photos. She had convinced about a dozen homeowners to support her proposal for strict dock regulations. Frank looked exhausted as he called the meeting to order. "Before we begin, I want to note that our HOA attorney has reviewed the proposed dock regulations and Aaron's property rights." "Linda, would you like to explain?" Linda Henderson, the HOA's lawyer, stood up with obvious reluctance. "After reviewing all the documentation, it's my opinion that the HOA cannot regulate Aaron O'Brien's dock. He owns the submerged land rights, which makes that lake bed his private property. The dock is on his property, built with proper permits, and predates any attempt at regulation. Implementing restrictions now would be both unenforceable and would expose the HOA to significant legal liability." "That's unacceptable," Brenda said loudly. "We have rights too. We have the right to preserve our property values and our views." "You have no legal right to a view across someone else's property," Linda said firmly. "This is well established in Minnesota law. Even if Aaron did not own the lake bed, you would have no claim. But given that he does own it, this is completely open and shut." "Then we need a new lawyer," Brenda declared. "One who will actually fight for the homeowners instead of siding with someone who is clearly violating community standards." Frank sighed. "Brenda, we're not firing our lawyer because she's telling us the law. If you want to pursue this personally, that's your choice, but the HOA is not going to be part of it." "Fine," Brenda said, her voice cold. "Then I'll handle this myself." The meeting moved on to other business, but Brenda sat in the back row, typing furiously on her phone. I knew this was far from over. 2 weeks later, I received a summons. Brenda had filed a lawsuit against me in Hennepin County District Court, claiming my dock constituted a private nuisance, violated her right to the reasonable use and enjoyment of her property, and diminished her property value. She was seeking an injunction to force me to remove the dock, plus $50,000 in damages. Patricia was not surprised. "Some people need to learn lessons the hard way," she said. "Don't worry. We'll file a motion to dismiss based on your property rights. This should not even get to trial." But Brenda's new lawyer, a more aggressive attorney named Richard Vance, fought the motion to dismiss. He argued that property rights were not absolute, that reasonable restrictions applied even to private property, and that my dock created a unique harm that justified court intervention. The judge, a tired-looking man named Judge Robert Morrison, denied the motion to dismiss and set the case for trial in October. "He's giving her enough rope to hang herself," Patricia explained. "He knows she will lose, but he wants a full record so she cannot claim she did not get her day in court." The months leading up to trial were miserable. Brenda made it her personal mission to make my life difficult. She filed a complaint with the county claiming my dock violated setback requirements, which required me to provide all my documentation to the building inspector. The inspector confirmed everything was proper and closed the complaint. She reported me to the DNR claiming I was illegally modifying the shoreline. That investigation also cleared me. She even called the police claiming I was harassing her, though we had not spoken since the HOA meeting. She also began a whisper campaign in the neighborhood. Suddenly, people who had been friendly started avoiding me. Someone started a Facebook group called Whispering Pines Community Concerns, where Brenda posted daily updates about the lawsuit, always painting herself as a brave homeowner fighting against a selfish neighbor who refused to compromise. The stress was getting to me. I had moved to Lake Minnetonka for peace and quiet, not legal battles and neighborhood drama. Some days I wondered if it would be easier to just move, but Patricia talked me out of it. If you cave now, you're setting a precedent that bullies can win through harassment, she said. Plus, you'll never get a fair price for your house with this lawsuit pending. We see this through, we win, and then you can decide what you want to do. As trial approached, Patricia and I prepared extensively. We had the deed, the surveys, the permits, photographs, expert testimony from a surveyor, and case law supporting our position. Brenda and Richard Vance had her testimony, her misleading photographs, and an appraiser who claimed her property value had dropped $30,000 because of my dock. The trial began on October 15th. The courthouse was in downtown Minneapolis, a massive stone building that always made me nervous. Judge Morrison presided with an air of barely concealed impatience, as if he had 100 more important things to deal with. Brenda testified first, describing how she had fallen in love with the lake view when she bought her house, how she had paid a premium for the property based on that view, and how my dock had destroyed her enjoyment of her home. "Can you see the lake from your property?" Patricia asked on cross-examination. "Yes," Brenda said. "Can you see it clearly?" "Well, not as clearly as I should because of the dock." Patricia pulled up photographs taken from Brenda's deck. "These were taken last week from your back deck. Can you point out the dock in question?" Brenda squinted at the images. The photos showed trees, neighboring houses, and a distant glimpse of water. My dock was barely visible, a small structure far in the background. "It's there," Brenda said defensively. "You can see it." "You can see a small portion of it if you know where to look," Patricia said. "But it hardly dominates the view, does it?" "It ruins the entire aesthetic," Brenda insisted. Patricia then showed aerial photographs demonstrating the actual distances involved and the sight lines. It was clear to anyone looking objectively that my dock could not possibly have the impact Brenda claimed. Brenda's appraiser testified next, a nervous young man who seemed uncomfortable with his own conclusions. Patricia's cross-examination destroyed his credibility. "What comparable sales did you use to determine the property lost $30,000 in value?" Patricia asked. "I looked at sales trends in the area," he said vaguely. "Did you find any sales where a distant dock affected property values?" "Not specifically, but the principle applies." "So you have no actual data supporting your conclusion. It's a professional judgment based on experience." "How much experience do you have appraising lakefront property?" He hesitated. "This was my first lakefront appraisal." Several people in the courtroom, including Judge Morrison, could not quite hide their reactions to that admission. When it was our turn, Patricia methodically established every element of my case. The surveyor testified about the property boundaries and the submerged land rights. I testified about building the dock with proper permits and the timeline of Brenda's complaints. Patricia introduced the deed, the permits, and case after case establishing that property owners in Minnesota had the right to build on their own land. The closing arguments were stark. Richard Vance argued passionately about community standards and property rights being balanced against each other, but he could not get around the fundamental problem that I owned the land and had acted legally. Patricia's closing was brief. "Your Honor, this case is simple. Aaron O'Brien owns the lake bed. He built a dock on his own property with proper permits. The plaintiff has no legal right to demand he remove a lawful structure from his private property simply because she does not like looking at it from 3 lots away. Minnesota law is clear on this point. We respectfully request you dismiss this lawsuit with prejudice and award costs and attorney fees to the defendant." Judge Morrison took less than an hour to rule. When we returned to the courtroom, he looked directly at Brenda with an expression that was not kind. "I have reviewed all the evidence and the relevant law," he began. "This lawsuit is without merit. The defendant owns the submerged land rights, which makes the lake bed in question his private property. He built his dock with all proper permits and in compliance with all applicable regulations. The HOA has no restrictions on docks, and even if it did, those restrictions could not be applied retroactively to a structure built years before they were proposed." He turned to Brenda. "Miss Carmichael, you purchased a property that is set back from the water with a limited lake view. You had the opportunity to inspect the property and the neighborhood before buying. The defendant's dock was clearly visible and had existed for over a year before your purchase. You have no legal basis to demand he modify or remove his property to improve your distant view." Judge Morrison straightened his papers. "The plaintiff's lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice. The defendant is awarded costs and reasonable attorney fees. Furthermore, I am putting on the record that this lawsuit appears to have been filed for purposes of harassment rather than legitimate legal grievance. Miss Carmichael, I strongly advise you to accept this ruling and cease your campaign against your neighbor." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the courtroom. Brenda sat frozen, her face white. Richard Vance gathered his papers quickly, clearly wanting to escape. I felt a wave of relief so strong my knees went weak. Outside the courthouse, Patricia was grinning. That was as decisive as it gets. He did not just rule against her, he essentially called her a vexatious litigant. If she tries anything else, that will be on the record. "Is it really over?" I asked. "The lawsuit is over. Now we file for costs and fees. I'll submit my invoices and the judge will determine what is reasonable. You should recover most of your legal expenses." Over the next few weeks, I waited for the other shoe to drop, but Brenda seemed to have finally accepted defeat. The Facebook group went silent. The whisper campaign stopped. When I saw her at the mailboxes one day, she turned and walked the other way without a word. In December, the judge awarded me $23,000 in attorney fees and costs. Patricia filed a lien against Brenda's property to secure payment. Brenda paid within a week, probably to avoid further legal complications. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal. People who had been avoiding me started waving again and stopping to chat. Margaret brought over Christmas cookies and apologized for the whole ordeal. "Some of us tried to tell her she was wrong," she said, "but she was so convinced she was right." Frank resigned as HOA president, exhausted by the drama. A younger couple took over, and one of their first acts was to send a formal letter to all homeowners clarifying that the HOA would not regulate docks or pursue nuisance complaints based on aesthetics. They wanted to make sure everyone understood the lesson from the lawsuit. As winter set in and the lake froze over, I spent my evenings in the covered section of my dock, now enclosed with plastic sheeting to keep out the wind. I had added a small propane heater and some comfortable chairs. It became my winter refuge, a place to read and think and watch the snow fall over the ice. One evening in late January, as I sat in my dock watching the sunset paint the frozen lake in shades of orange and pink, I reflected on the entire bizarre situation. I had come to Lake Minnetonka seeking peace, and instead I had found conflict. But I had also discovered something important about standing your ground when you are right. Brenda had been so convinced of her entitlement, so certain that her desires should override my rights, that she had spent months and thousands of dollars on a losing battle. She had never stopped to actually examine whether she had a legal leg to stand on. She had assumed that being loud and persistent would be enough, but the law does not work that way. Property rights matter. Due diligence matters. Building with proper permits matters. The system is not perfect, but it generally protects people who follow the rules from those who try to impose their will through sheer aggression. I did not take pleasure in Brenda's defeat. I took no joy in the money she had to pay, or the humiliation of having a judge essentially call her lawsuit harassment. What I felt was relief that the system had worked, that my rights had been protected, and that I could finally enjoy my property in peace. The dock had become more than just a structure. It represented my right to live my life on my terms, to make reasonable use of my property, and to not be bullied into submission by someone who thought their preferences were more important than my rights. Every morning when I walked down to the water, every evening when I sat at the end of the dock watching the sun set, I was affirming something fundamental about ownership and autonomy. Spring came, and the ice melted. I removed the winter enclosure and opened up the dock for the season. The first time I sat there with my coffee, watching the early morning mist rise off the water, felt like a new beginning. I started seeing boats again as the weather warmed. Fishermen would wave as they passed. Sometimes they would stop and chat, asking about the fishing or commenting on the dock. "Nice setup," more than one person said. It reminded me that most people were reasonable, that Brenda's vendetta had been an aberration rather than the norm. In April, I noticed a for sale sign go up at Brenda's house. I was not surprised. She had poured so much energy into hating that dock and fighting me that she had probably never actually enjoyed living there. Within 6 weeks, the house sold. I never saw her again. The new owners were a retired couple from St. Paul named David and Susan. They came by to introduce themselves within days of moving in. "We love the neighborhood," Susan said warmly, "and that dock of yours is beautiful. We're thinking of building one ourselves." I helped them navigate the permit process and recommended a contractor. By July, they had a nice dock of their own, smaller than mine but perfect for their needs. We began meeting up in the evening sometimes, sitting on our respective docks and chatting across the water. The community continued to heal from the Brenda drama. The new HOA board was younger and more focused on actual community building rather than petty enforcement. They organized a summer barbecue by the lake, and for the first time since I moved in, I felt like I was really part of a neighborhood rather than just living in proximity to other people. Margaret told me one day that she had heard through the grapevine that Brenda had moved to Arizona. "I guess she wanted to get as far from lakes and docks as possible," Margaret said with a laugh. I did feel a bit of sympathy for her. Whatever demons drove her to fixate on my dock, they had cost her time, money, and ultimately her home. If she had just accepted that she bought a property set back from the water and made peace with it, she could have had a perfectly nice life in Whispering Pines. Instead, she had turned her own home into a monument to frustration and resentment. The legal victory also gave me a new appreciation for documentation and due diligence. When I bought the property, I had been meticulous about understanding what I was buying, including those unusual submerged land rights. I had kept every permit, every survey, every piece of paper related to the dock construction. That attention to detail had saved me when the lawsuit came. I started advising younger friends and family members about the importance of knowing exactly what they owned and keeping good records. You never know when someone will challenge you, I would say. Make sure you can prove your rights. Patricia and I stayed in touch. She sent me a nice bottle of whiskey after the case was fully closed, with a note saying it was one of the more satisfying victories of her career. Most property disputes are murky, she wrote. This one was crystal clear, and it was nice to see the right outcome. I displayed the bottle on a shelf in my dock, unopened. It served as a reminder of the battle and the victory, but also of the importance of having good people in your corner when things get difficult. As the summer of 2025 progressed, I found myself more content than I had been in years. The stress of the lawsuit had lifted, Brenda was gone, and I could finally just enjoy my retirement. I took up kayaking, launching from my dock every morning to explore the lake. I started a small garden on the shore near the dock. I spent long afternoons reading in the covered section, listening to the water lap against the posts. The dock had been worth fighting for, not just because of the principle, but because it really was special. The time and care I had put into building it showed in every detail. The wood had weathered beautifully. The solar lights created a perfect ambience in the evenings. The covered section provided shade on hot days and shelter when storms rolled in suddenly. I also began documenting the wildlife around the dock. Herons would fish off the edges in the early morning. Ducks nested in the reeds nearby. Once, a bald eagle landed on the railing and sat there for 10 minutes, so close I could see every detail of its feathers. I took up photography to capture these moments. Frank stopped by one day in his boat. He had been mostly absent from community activities since resigning as HOA president, and I had not spoken to him much during the lawsuit. "I owe you an apology," he said as I helped him tie up to my dock. "I should have shut Brenda down harder at that first meeting. I knew she was wrong, but I tried to stay neutral, and that just gave her room to escalate." "You were in a tough position," I said. "Still, I let her turn the HOA into her personal weapon. That was not right." He looked out at the water. "I held that president role for so long because nobody else wanted it, but by the end, I did not want it either. I was just going through the motions. When someone like Brenda shows up with energy and conviction, even if they are completely wrong, they can dominate the conversation." We talked for a while about leadership and community dynamics. Frank had learned his lesson about appeasement, and I had learned mine about standing firm. It was a good conversation, the kind that brings closure. As fall approached again, I began preparing for my second winter at the lake. I had learned a lot from the first one about weatherizing the dock and making it comfortable for cold weather use. This time, I installed a better heating system and added insulation to the plastic enclosure. I was looking forward to those quiet winter evenings. The anniversary of the lawsuit's dismissal came and went. I marked it privately with a toast from my dock, raising a glass to property rights and the rule of law. It felt good to have that chapter fully closed. In November, the new HOA board asked me to join as a member. They wanted someone with experience navigating legal issues, and they felt my presence would signal that the organization had truly moved past the Brenda era. I agreed, figuring it was time to be more involved in community leadership. My first act as a board member was to propose a community fund to help homeowners with legal expenses if they were wrongfully targeted by frivolous complaints or lawsuits. Nobody should have to spend $20,000 defending their rights, I argued. The other board members agreed, and we set up a small reserve fund for that purpose. We also updated the community guidelines to explicitly state that homeowners were free to make reasonable improvements to their properties, including docks, as long as they complied with applicable laws and regulations. The HOA would not micromanage aesthetics or impose retroactive requirements. These changes were approved unanimously at the annual meeting. The community seemed relieved to have clear boundaries and rational leadership. Several people thanked me personally for standing up to Brenda and setting a precedent against bullying. As 2025 turned into 2026, I found myself in an unexpected position. I had moved to Lake Minnetonka to escape, to find solitude and peace after decades of hard work. Instead, I had been pulled into conflict, forced to fight a legal battle, and ultimately pushed into community leadership. But somehow, it had all worked out. The conflict had revealed who my real neighbors were, the people who stood by me rather than getting swept up in Brenda's campaign. The lawsuit had reinforced my property rights in a way that would protect not just me but future homeowners. The leadership role gave me purpose and connection. The dock remained the center of my daily life. I was there every morning and every evening, regardless of weather or season. It was where I thought through problems, where I celebrated small victories, where I found peace in the rhythm of the water. Sometimes, when I sat there in the early morning darkness waiting for sunrise, I thought about how close I had come to just giving in to Brenda's demands. It would have been easier in the short term to move the dock, or modify it, or even tear it down. Anything to make the complaints stop. But easy and right are not always the same thing. Standing up for my rights had been hard, stressful, and expensive. It had cost me sleep and peace of mind for months. But it had been the right thing to do, both for myself and for the principle it established. I had learned that property rights mean nothing if people are not willing to defend them. Documents and deeds and surveys only matter if you stand behind them when challenged. The legal system provides the framework, but individuals have to have the courage to use it. One evening in February, as I sat in my winterized dock watching the sun set over the frozen lake, David and Susan came walking across the ice. We had started doing this occasionally, meeting in the middle between our properties to chat and share a thermos of hot chocolate. "I heard someone made an offer on Brenda's old place," Susan said. "Already?" I asked. The house had only been on the market for a few days. "Young family from Minneapolis," David said. "They have 2 kids." Apparently, they specifically loved the neighborhood because of the lake access and the docks. We all laughed at the irony. The very thing Brenda had fought so hard against was now attracting new buyers who appreciated the community character. "The realtor told them the whole story," Susan added. "About the lawsuit and everything. They thought it was hilarious that someone would sue over a dock 3 lots away." "I hope they are nice," I said. "I've had enough drama for a lifetime." As it turned out, the new family was delightful. They moved in March, and their kids immediately took to the water. By April, they were asking me for advice on kayaks and fishing gear. The father, whose name was Tom, was an engineer and was fascinated by how I had built my dock. We spent several afternoons going over the design and construction details. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The HOA board met monthly and handled routine business without drama. The community organized potlucks and movie nights. I taught a few kids how to fish from my dock. My garden by the shore flourished. The lawsuit became a story I told occasionally. Usually when someone asked about the unusually detailed documentation I kept for every home improvement project. "Let me tell you about the time my neighbor sued me over my dock," I would begin, and the story would unfold. It always got good reactions. Most people could not believe someone would be that unreasonable, but the story also served as a teaching moment. Property rights matter. Documentation matters. Standing your ground when you are right matters. These lessons resonated with people, especially in a time when it sometimes felt like the loudest voice won regardless of facts or law. By the summer of 2026, I had been on Lake Minnetonka for 7 years. The dock that had caused so much trouble was now firmly established as a beloved community landmark. Kids used it as a jumping-off point for swimming. Neighbors borrowed it for fishing. During the 4th of July, it became the best viewing platform for the fireworks over the lake. I had fought for my right to build and keep that dock, and in doing so, I had created something that enriched not just my life but the entire community. That was the ultimate vindication. Brenda had claimed my dock was a selfish eyesore that harmed the neighborhood. In reality, it had become a gathering place that brought people together. One Saturday afternoon in July, the HOA organized a community dock party. Various homeowners with docks opened them up for a progressive party, with food and drinks at each stop. People walked or boated from dock to dock, enjoying the summer weather and each other's company. My dock was the final stop, and I provided fresh grilled fish and my famous coleslaw. As the sun set and the solar lights flickered on, about 30 neighbors gathered on and around the dock, talking and laughing. Children jumped off the end into the water, squealing with delight. Adults sat on the benches with drinks, watching the sky turn colors. Margaret came up to me as the party wound down. "This is what a community should be," she said. "Not fighting and lawsuits, but this, people enjoying each other and the beautiful place we live." "I agree," I said. "It took a while to get here, but it was worth it." As the last guests left and I cleaned up, I sat alone on my dock for a while, just enjoying the quiet. The legal battle with Brenda felt like ancient history now, even though it had only been a bit over a year since the judge's ruling. So much had changed and healed since then. I thought about Judge Morrison's words, how he had called the lawsuit harassment and ruled so decisively in my favor. That ruling had done more than just protect my dock. It had established clear boundaries about what was acceptable behavior in the community. It had sent a message that bullying and frivolous legal action would not be tolerated. In a way, Brenda had done the community a favor by being so unreasonable. She had forced the HOA to clarify its rules and its values. She had pushed me into a leadership role where I could help shape a better community culture. She had inadvertently made the neighborhood stronger by revealing, and then cauterizing a cancer of petness and entitlement. I wondered sometimes if she had found happiness in Arizona, if she had learned anything from the experience, if she regretted the time and money and energy she had wasted on a losing battle. I hoped she had. Not out of spite, but because I genuinely believed that holding on to that kind of anger and entitlement could only lead to misery. As for me, I had found something I did not expect when I moved to Lake Minnetonka. I had been looking for solitude and peace, a quiet place to spend my retirement. What I found instead was a home, a real community of people who looked out for each other, and a sense of purpose in protecting not just my rights, but the principles that allowed everyone to live freely. The dock remained my favorite place, my sanctuary, the physical manifestation of everything I had fought for. Every plank, every post, every nail represented my right to live my life on my terms. And every sunset I watched from that covered bench, every morning coffee I drank from that end rail, every fish I caught from those edges was a quiet celebration of that victory. I had stood my ground when it would have been easier to fold. I had defended my rights when they were challenged. I had refused to be bullied into submission. And in doing so, I had not just preserved my dock. I had preserved something much more important, the principle that property rights matter, that following the law protects you, and that standing up to unreasonable demands is not just possible but necessary. As the summer of 2026 continued, I realized I had never been happier. The years of hard work in construction, the careful saving, the decision to buy this particular property with its unique submerged land rights, the time and care put into building the perfect dock, the stress and cost of defending it in court, all of it had led to this moment, sitting on my dock on a perfect summer evening, watching the water reflect the stars, knowing I was exactly where I belonged. The dock that Brenda claimed blocked her view had become my window to a life I had always wanted but never quite imagined. It was more than a structure. It was a statement, a testament, a victory. And every day I used it was another day of proving that standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it's expensive, even when it's stressful, is always worth it in the end. I raised my glass one more time in the darkness, toasting the dock, the lake, the community, and the simple but profound principle that had carried me through. Own what's yours, document everything, and never back down when you're right. It was a lesson I had learned the hard way, but it was one I would carry with me for the rest of my life.